Hello, and welcome to this week's lecture on the topic of memory in social cognition. So this week we're going to start off by recapping some of the basics of memory. So this comes with an assumption that you have attended the Intro to Cognition course, and a lot of these basic principles of memory, so the way memory is structured, the fact we've got different long-term, short-term memory stores. I'm assuming that you have this knowledge already, but we're going to do a kind of brief recap of some of these core principles. We're then going to cover how memories are represented. So if you think of all of this different information that's around us, how is it that we turn this into a format that we're able to then represent and store in long-term memory? We're going to focus as well on the importance of schemas, and particularly how our knowledge and expectations of what is likely to occur in a particular situation or scenario, how that can be really fundamental for helping us smoothly interact with the world around us. And then we're going to shift our attention to the much more social nature of memory, and particularly how we can store, represent memories of other people and the factors that are important here. It's hard to underestimate the importance of memory in our everyday perceptual experience. So every act of perception is an act of categorization. So when we're looking around perceiving things, it typically ends with us categorizing or identifying the object, the stimulus that we're looking at. And it's memory that provides this conceptual knowledge that allows categorization to occur. So as I look down and I see this object, I immediately know that it's a glass. I know the function of it. I know how I should interact with it. I know that it's delicate, that I should pick it up without applying too much force to it, so I shouldn't grip it really tightly with my hand, or there's a chance it's going to break. But without all of that background conceptual knowledge of what the item is, what its function, the physical properties of glass, would really struggle to perceive and interact with the environment. And further, memory frees behavior from dominance by the immediate stimulus environment. So in other words, if we had no memory of our expectations, our beliefs, our desires, what you might end up doing is just being drawn to approach things that we kind of know innately, that are rewarding. So you would approach things such as food, things that we find appetitive, and we would avoid things that we find threatening or aversive. But we'd have a pretty limited extent of behavior that we could engage in, of just approaching good things, avoiding bad things. Whereas this memory allows us to be much more flexible and adaptive in our behavior. Okay, before we talk about how we store and represent things in memory, let's just start by having a very basic recap of some of the fundamentals of human memory. So first of all, we've got this fundamental distinction between short and long-term memory systems. So primary or short-term memory systems are characterized by the fact that you've got this temporal decay. So things are, based on their name, they're stored there for a short time period. So anywhere from sort of 30 seconds to a couple of minutes. They have a limited capacity as well, so George Miller's famous 7 plus or minus 2. And then, as we saw on the topics of working memory, this is where our contents of consciousness, or the current perceptual experience that we're having, it's stuff that is held in a kind of working memory or short-term memory store. We then have secondary or long-term memory. Technically, capacity is unlimited. Nobody is able to test what the actual limit to it is, but theoretically, there seems like there's certainly no relationship with the sort of storage on your computer, that you hit a certain point where you've stored enough memories that you then have to start forgetting or clearing space to store new memories. So essentially it's unlimited, and it relies on long-term potentiation, so strengthening of the synapse based on recent patterns of activity. It's also the case that we have this activation in the hippocampus that then spreads out into the storage of long-term memory, is often distributed across the cortex. And within these memory systems, if we look at the sort of structure of these, so we have procedural memories, which are typically implicit, so they're outside of our conscious control, cover stuff such as our motor actions, but they can also be cognitive, so it can be that innate knowledge and understanding that we have of what rules that we should use when interacting with each others. So the distance that you should stand away from another person when you're talking to them. Typically it's sort of socially polite to do a sort of 1 meter distance, or not straight up in somebody's face. There's also times when we can adjust that, like right now when you're expected to maybe stand a little bit further away from people. There's also ways that we would automatically form impressions of others. So these are implicit automatic processes that we're doing. When you meet somebody and you watch them behave in a particular way, it's not like you're going through a checklist of thinking about their behavior and then mentally trying to add it up to come to a judgment of what do you think of this person. We just implicitly and automatically come to judgments and make impressions of other people. We then have declarative or explicit memories. So these can be episodic memories for the fact that you had a particular meal for dinner last night, the last time you went swimming, etc. Whilst we can then have semantic, which is our knowledge. Basically think of it as a sort of general knowledge store. So understanding that an episodic memory, you had rice for dinner last night. A semantic memory is the knowledge that rice is white. It's a grain that can be cooked. Or whenever you went last swimming, semantic knowledge is the knowledge of that swimming pools have a pH level, etc. Okay, just to maybe go over in a bit more detail and repeat some of the stuff that was on the previous slide. If we think of procedural memory, we can think of these as just skills and habits. Or another way is the use of if-then statements. So if something happens, then what is the corresponding action or approach that I should take? And these are basically like automatic things that as soon as this if is triggered, the then automatically happens. So at a sort of motor behavior level, some things in a social domain that would work is the fact that if you want to be liked by other people, then something that would make sense to do is to make eye contact with them, or it might be to reciprocate their behavior. So these are things that we wouldn't necessarily consciously engage, but we just automatically do based on the fact that we want to make a good impression. We want to be admired or liked by them. Another one might be, depending on the culture and how acceptable it is to display emotion in public, it might be the case if you're feeling very emotional, you feel like you might be about to cry, then you would suppress this and avoid showing that emotional display in public. Again, something that you're probably not going to think about too consciously, but if you feel yourself about to get emotional or cry, you just automatically stifle that emotional display. And then again, if we're engaged in conversation, we'd automatically then stand a reasonable distance from the other person. And you'll notice this if you watch two people in conversation and one person moves a little bit too close, so within their own personal space, the other person is likely to sort of subtly shift a little bit back. But in the majority of our interactions with other people, we're not consciously attending to what is the distance from me to the person I'm talking to. We're not getting a tape measure out and just checking it's okay, but we're automatically picking up on probably very subtle cues about whether they feel comfortable, and just an automatic normal distance that you would stand in order to arrive at an appropriate distance when you're having a conversation. Again, at the more cognitive level, if we're trying to form an impression of somebody, then what we'd end up doing is automatically paying more attention to central traits about the person as opposed to more peripheral traits. So we focus on the things that are more informative or useful for us coming to a judgment about whether we like or dislike the person. And again, we're just doing this automatically. If you want to understand or analyze the cause of someone's behavior, then we would search for information to do with regarding the consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness of behavior. So this is something we'll come across in Kelly's ANOVA model of making attributions. This is something we're not doing automatically. So we're not consciously thinking of what is the consensus, consistency, how distinct is their behavior. But there's pretty compelling data that shows people do this. They do engage in these processes, but it's just at a sort of automatic or implicit level. In contrast, we also have declarative memories that can be distinguished into episodic and semantic. So episodic memory consists first and foremost, and probably most important for social cognition, is an individual's autobiographical memory. So this is a record of one's own experiences, our thoughts, and our actions. And these are a really important part of our own self-concept. So what autobiographical stories we end up telling about ourselves is what ends up shaping our perception and our concept that we have of who we are as individuals. So autobiographical memories have to relate to generally a specific experience, time, and a place. There are some exceptions to this, but generally that's the case. And then they need to relate to the self through agency. So in other words, you are fundamental to the particular story, you're part of it, or it could be the case that it's an internal mental state that we have an autobiographical memory for. So it could be an example of something where you have daydreamed or mentally constructed some sort of scenario, and then we can still store a autobiographical memory of that daydreaming or that sort of fantasy representation that's there. And then finally we also have semantic memory. So this consists of basically all of our knowledge of the world that is around us. So our episodic memories and autobiographical memories would not go very far in the absence of some basic semantic memory to understand and interpret what it is that's in our environment. So this extends to linguistic knowledge, knowledge of syntax, pragmatics, it can be knowledge of objects, knowledge of how to categorize these objects, to what category member does an object belong to. It can also include stuff like our implicit theories about personalities, so our understanding that neurotics are anxious individuals and that extroverted people are talkative and sociable. It's also worth considering here that what is it exactly that we end up representing in the mind for a stored representation or a stored memory of something. And it's not the case that we end up storing actual reality, so we're not storing photographic representations or like a kind of video recording of events that have happened to us. Rather, what we end up doing is storing symbols that are there to represent the external experience or external reality. So we've got a structure in our mind, either an idea or an image that will stand for some objective aspect of reality here. And these can be either visual or verbal. So at a verbal level, we can store things using propositional language. We'll come on to that in a second. Or it might be the case that we store representations that are presented visually, but again, it's not in the form of a sort of photographic representation. It's through some form of structural representation. So we might have a very basic structural image of an object or something. Or finally, we can store things where we store knowledge of the entire perceptual correlates of an experience. So for example, it's possible to store and imagine the knowledge of what it feels like to swim So you can bring up that representation of what's the feeling as I run my hand through the water, or how does it feel when I throw a ball really hard. Okay, let me give you the following scenario. So imagine that you're standing at a busy intersection, you're waiting for the light to change, and across the street you see a young man knock down an elderly woman, grab her purse and run away. How do you go about representing that knowledge that you have there in some sort of declarative long-term memory store? Now, it's not an easy question to answer. One approach that's tried to tackle this question is through the idea that we have associate networks or associate network models. And within these models, memory is then represented in what's known as a propositional format. So again, if you remember from the associative networks that we looked at with spreading activation theory, a central idea is that you have individual nodes that correspond to a concept, an idea, that could be a specific noun, adjective, and then there's links that connect each of these individual concepts or ideas, nouns, adjectives, to one another. The proposition representation is just saying that we then break down this knowledge into the smallest units possible about which it makes sense to make a true or false judgment. And a lot of this comes from concepts in logic and linguistics to describe their relationship. Now, much of that probably doesn't make much sense when you're listening to me talk about it. It seems rather abstract. So let's break down that scenario that you read earlier or listened to me, and just see the different propositions that are contained within there. And again, I don't want you to worry about the detail that's on this. I just want you to maybe grasp some of the key principles here. So we've got 5 propositions that come out of this. The first one is just simply that the woman is elderly. The second one, we learned that the woman is standing on the corner. We then learned that the man knocks down the woman. So the man is the agent here, and the subject is the woman. We then learned that the man is young. And finally, the man is an adult. So these are 5 of the smallest bits of knowledge here that we can each confirm is true, and those are represented by ellipses on here. So how is it that any sort of spreading activation occurs here? Or put simply, if you remember one of those nodes, it's going to spread out and activate whatever propositions and nodes are associated and linked with this. So if you recall that the woman is elderly, it's going to strengthen the link between these concepts of woman and elderly, so it's kind of strengthen this proposition that's there. And then it's also going to activate related nodes. So thinking about the woman is going to activate that second proposition as well, the fact that she was standing on the corner, etc. Okay, let's just see how this works in one more example. So Lincoln, who was president of the USA during a bitter war, freed the slaves. Now that sentence can be broken down into 3 smaller propositions. So first of all, Lincoln was president of the USA during the war. Then we know that the war was bitter, and then we know that Lincoln freed the slaves. So if we were to represent each of those propositions, within a proposition we generally have an agent, which is the person doing the action. There's a subject or the recipient of the action, and then there's some link between the 2 of these. So some relational or association between them. So if we look at A on here, we're mapping out that proposition that Lincoln was President of the United States during a war. Proposition B is that the war was bitter, and Proposition C is that Lincoln freed the slaves. So Lincoln is the agent, the slaves the object, and his relation to them is that he is freeing them. Now we can then combine all of that information from those 3 propositions together to represent that entire sentence, that entire piece of knowledge there. Okay, and one area where we can use our memory that's really useful for us is through the development of schemas. So schemas is something you should be very familiar with already, but they're basically like a kind of cognitive framework or concept that helps us to organize and interpret information. And we have a range of different schemas. So one you may not be familiar with is the idea of person schemas. So if I imagine that I asked you the question, what kind of person is Sally? A person schema would reflect our categorization of the person based on whatever is the most sort of dominant or central personality trait that they have. So it might be you think Sally is really highly extroverted, and that's your person schema for Sally. She's an extroverted individual. And categorizing her that way can be useful for trying to interpret and explain her subsequent behavior. We also have self schemas. So these are cognitive generalizations about the self. Basically, if I ask the question, how would you describe yourself? These really salient and stable individual traits that come to mind form part of your self schema. And then finally we can have role schemas. So these are schemas or knowledge structures for the norms and expected behaviors of specific roles in society. And these can either be roles that we've achieved through promotion, talent, merit, etc. Such for having the role of being a doctor, a psychologist, etc. Or they can be roles that we haven't necessarily wanted to put ourselves into, but we're just ascribed them because of our basic characteristics, so to do with our age, gender, race, or status. And these are the ones that we kind of most automatically or typically have schemas. So we have a role schema for someone that is young versus someone that is old. We have a role schema for someone that's male versus someone that's female. I know in kind of 21st century these shouldn't really differ, but a lot of the time we do develop maybe different expectations for how men and women should behave. We also have event schemas or scripts. So these are generally details of the expected events that are likely to occur in a sort of sequential order. So an example of a script that you might have for eating in a restaurant or a cafe, you have information about the fact that it costs us money to eat there. So this is very basic. You would have knowledge of whether do you normally sit down in a restaurant, do you stand up? Based on the type of restaurant, you might have an understanding of the typical kind of food that it will sell. You know how long it will take to get food normally. You know when you go in whether you have to order something off of a menu or whether you would typically go up to the counter and order from there. You know the norms about leaving a tip for service afterwards. Is it appropriate to sit on a table with other people that you don't know as in strangers, or can you sit by yourself? Now obviously things change in current society, so you might have to update or correct our typical event schemas for eating out in a restaurant. But generally there's a list of things that will help us predict and anticipate what would go on when you go into a restaurant. So that's one of the reasons that, say if you are abroad and you go to a cafe in an unfamiliar country that might have different norms and you don't have an event scheme or a script for how you're meant to behave in those restaurants, that you can end up sitting at a table for ages and nobody's coming over to take your order. Some of the important characteristics of schemas. First one, they provide theory-driven structures. So they offer some expectancy that guides the way that we end up processing the input and the information that's coming in. And again, much of our information processing is driven by expectation. So it's driven by theory rather than just being driven by the pure bottom-up stimulus or the bottom-up data. They are energy-saving devices. So being able to have a schema and categorize things simply allows us to process information without attending to every possible detail. And we also find out that having a schema can really facilitate our memory for events. So if we find out that you are presented with information that is inconsistent with the current schema, this tends to get recalled better because it stands out as being surprising. So an example of this might be if you're told that somebody is really intelligent, and then you find out some information that they get a very simple general knowledge question incorrect, you're much more likely to remember that bit of information about the person because it's inconsistent with, you would expect this really intelligent person to get this question correct, and it stands out, it's surprising. We also have better memory for schema consistent information. So things that fit the schema, we can easily assimilate them. They're what we would expect. And then when we're tested later, we're more likely to pick out and remember those bits of information. The times that we have worse memory is when information is just schema irrelevant. If we think about how schemas develop, it's pretty straightforward that we begin with some initial knowledge. So if we think of the schema for females, we might start off with very basic knowledge, such as the fact that they typically play with dolls, that they wear pink. Again, I'm not saying these are necessarily correct stereotypes, but this might be a schema that you form for females. As we grow older, we start to add in additional bits of information. So we notice physical differences, there's difference in preferred activities, there's different occupations that might be taken up by women as opposed to men. And then with further experience, we start to add in some of the more contradictions and exceptions, such as we know that whilst there might be differences in occupations, that equality is important, that all jobs should be open and available for women partaking in. So we can add those into our schematic representation.
We now know how we process information, from our sensory register into our working memory and then into our long-term memory. But the next question is, how is that information stored in our long-term memory? Do we have millions of individual pieces of information floating around in our heads? Or is our knowledge better organized than that? What we know is that our knowledge is actually organized. Piaget used the term schemas to describe the fact that information is actually connected to each other in our mind. So if we use the example of an egg, everything that we know about an egg will be connected to that central concept. We know that it has a shell, we know that it's nutritious, we know that you can buy it at a grocery store. To illustrate the concept of a schema, let's look at an adult schema of an egg, or at least what an adult schema might look like. So here at the center we see the concept of an egg. And attached to this central concept is everything an adult might know about an egg. In fact, they probably know a lot more than this, but we're simplifying just to illustrate the idea that all of this information is connected. We see some information that's really close to that central concept, so an egg has a shell is something that would be very close to the center. And we see things that are a little bit further removed, still related to the concept of an egg, but something like eggs have cholesterol isn't something that immediately comes to mind when you think of the concept of an egg. What's important here is that all of this information is related. So when you think about an egg, you can quickly and easily access all of this other information rather than having to sort through a million different pieces of information floating around in your mind to find it. Important for educators is that children's schemas are less well developed than adult schemas. They don't have the same extent of background knowledge as adults do. So a child schema might look something like this. Now we see that it's not as well filled out. So educators need to realize where those gaps are, and the question is then, how do we move from this child schema to the adult schema? Piaget suggested that we learn in two main ways. This is how we construct our schemas and develop them. The first way is assimilation, and it occurs when we encounter new information, something that we've never seen before, information that we never knew. So using our egg example, let's say a child sees a colorful egg for the first time. It's all the colors of the rainbow and doesn't understand what that egg is. The eggs that they've seen before are typically white and brown. Their parent tells them that this is an Easter egg. And as they engage with these Easter eggs, they hunt for them, they have warm, fuzzy feelings, they associate it with their family. So this is all new information. It wasn't previously in their schema. What happens is they slot this new information into an empty space. As an analogy, think of it as you have a series of books on your bookcase, but you're missing the next volume. Once you get it, you just slot it into that empty space on your bookshelf. The other way that we learn or adapt our schemas is called accommodation. This occurs when we encounter something that actually conflicts with our existing schema. Let's take the example of a child who's only ever seen eggs in birds' nests. So as far as they're aware, only birds lay eggs. Yet on a trip to the beach, they see a turtle hatch from an egg. Well, there's a problem here. You can't have that only birds lay eggs and turtles lay eggs. Something has to change. So you'd either say that more than just birds can lay eggs, or what the turtle just hatched from wasn't an egg, but something in that schema needs to change. That process of change of our schemas is called accommodation. Remember that our knowledge is constructed into schemas. All information in our long-term memory is connected. The way that we develop those schemas, the way that we learn, is through assimilation, adding new information, and accommodation, which is actually making changes to our schemas so that they better reflect the world around us. This is important for educators because students' learning really needs to be linked in this schema form. So we need to link new learning with prior knowledge to help students construct schemas.
Okay, let's think about your best friend or someone that you know very closely. How do you think you represent them in memory? So what we're going to focus on in this section is some elements to do with the structure of person memory, and particularly from an approach of associative network, where we would assume that you would have a central node that represents each person, so each friend, each acquaintance, and then you have, spanning out from that main node that represents them, you would have various nodes that represent different facts about the person. So the corresponding identity, their name. You might have a node that represents the mental image of what is it that they look like. We have semantic person memory that relates to their traits, their attitudes. This person, are they friendly? Are they kind, nice, etc.? We would then have those that represent episodic person memory. So what are the shared experiences that you have had with this person? Again, we have associative links that would spread out and connect these different nodes together. So let's think about a simple example, as this is a friend, Doug, that I would have a mental image of what does Doug look like. Semantic representation of traits that are central and also peripheral to him, so all of that information about the character that he is, that I know he's adventurous, he's kind, he's also impulsive, but I also have more knowledge-based, the fact that he lives in Austria, that he has brown hair, and then episodic memories, times that we spent together traveling in Brazil, hanging out at festivals, etc. So an important question is, do we actually structure person memory like this, where we might have nodes linking out from one individual, and then how might we go about accessing this information? And some research that was done to investigate this was by John Anderson in 1974. And in this study, they would ask participants to remember a series of sentences that link a individual with a particular location. So in the real study, there was like over 25, 26 different sentences. Here I've just given you 4 examples of information that you might learn. So you learn that the doctor is in the bank, the fireman is in the park, the lawyer is in the church, and the lawyer is also in the park. So in this case, you're learning different amounts of information about each individual. So we've got one fact about the doctor, one fact about the bank, one fact about the fireman. We also have 2 facts about the lawyer. So he's in the church and he's also in the park. And we've got 2 facts about the park. The fireman is there and the lawyer is there. So one of the ways that the lawyer can be in the church and the park is that maybe the church is in the park, would be a valid statement. And subjects would then memorize these sentences until they hit a kind of perfect recall level. So they know them. And he wasn't necessarily interested in whether participants were going to make a mistake on it. What Anderson was more interested in was the reaction time, so the response latency. And the fan effect that he found was this sort of paradox of knowledge here. The more facts that people knew about a person or object, the longer it took them to verify that particular fact. So examples of the recognition test that you would get, you would be asked, the doctor is in the bank, yes or no. We'd have to say yes. We've been given that information, that's correct. Or alternatively, the doctor is in the park, the correct response to that would be no. So what we generally find then is it takes participants much longer to verify that the doctor is in the park compared to verifying that the lawyer is in the park. And again, we're talking small differences in reaction time here. But what Anderson suggested or interpreted this data to mean is that the more information that you have about an individual, the longer it's taking you to verify or confirm that one of those pieces of information is correct. So he was suggesting that the only reason or the only explanation for why it could take longer is if we're almost doing like a serial search from that person memory to each of those nodes or each of those bits of information that we have about the person. And when we've got more bits of information, we've got to search through each bit, so it's going to take you a little bit longer time to do it. Another interesting problem occurs with respect to separating out the information that we have about different people. So I'm going to give you a slightly weird example here, but I think it poses some nice theoretical questions about how we might store distinct representations of different people. So what if you learn the following information? John rescued the kitten, John adopted the child, the lawyer caused the accident, the lawyer swore at the salesperson. I think most people would think that you would represent this information as such. So we've got John here, who's associated with rescuing the kitten and adopting the child, and then we have the lawyer, who's associated with causing the accident and swearing at the salesperson. So that would make sense that you would structure up an initial representation of these two individuals. Now, the sort of theoretical flip side on this is that if I then give you extra information that John and the lawyer are actually the same person, what happens to your representation? And whilst this sounds hypothetical, certainly when we're watching a lot of movies, this is something that happens with a degree of regularity, that somebody might switch role, or there's a kind of plot twist that means you've been learning information about one character without necessarily knowing you were learning that information about them. So what happens to these two representations of John and the lawyer? One option is that we just keep these knowledge structures, these person memories entirely separate. That we have one for John, one for the lawyer. They don't merge together at all. However, the problem there is that we then wouldn't know that John caused the accident, for example. So, which John has caused the accident because he's the lawyer, but if we get them separate, we're not going to be able to make that link. So how could we make that link? Another possibility is that just simply all of the knowledge about the lawyer is linked directly to John. So we start off with this John node, and then we just assimilate and link in the fact that he caused the accident, he swore at the salesperson, and he's also the lawyer. Okay, so a third possibility is that when we learn that John is the lawyer, we've just established a new link between the John node and the lawyer node, and then we can make an inference from this that John caused the accident. So we've got all that information about John, all the information about the lawyer, and we just draw an association or connection there. So what do you think is more likely or plausible, and how might you test this? So again, if we go back to the sort of methods of cognitive psychology, what we're using here is small differences in reaction, response times, to indicate what those underlying cognitive processes might be. So what do they find, or what do they do? Well, they give people sentence verification tasks where you ask them to say, did John cause the accident? Did John swear at the salesperson? Did John adopt the child? Did John rescue the kitten? And what they found is that their reaction time for the sentence verification tasks, they were much quicker to respond to the question, did John rescue the kitten and adopt the child? On average, 3,000 milliseconds, whereas it would take 4,000 milliseconds to verify whether he caused the accident, or what was the other one, swore at the salesperson. And from that, we can make an inference that what's the most likely structure is this sort of linked representation, that because it's taking longer to verify the information that's associated with the lawyer, we must be traversing some other link or association in our memory that's causing that sort of small delay in time that is taken. So it's taking us a little bit longer to verify this inferential fact. Now, if we knew the reference that John is the lawyer at the very outset, we would just build a knowledge structure around a single node representing everything we know about the person. But if we get this information later on, then we end up establishing this link instead between the two of them. And this link just takes longer to traverse, which is why you get the longer response latency on there. Okay, so we've discussed these sort of very cognitive models of person memory, where we're talking about having a node that represents a person and this sort of associative network that spans out and is linked to kind of combine all this information together. But how exactly would that person memory look like at a neural level? And I think the most sort of simple or easiest answer of this might be the fact that you see the person node reflected as a single neuron, or maybe even a small cluster of neurons that are together. So these would then be located in a particular region of the brain. And early research that was done by Wilder Penfeld sort of supports or suggested this was the case. So he did research whilst he was doing work on patients with epilepsy, and he would stimulate areas of the brain with a microelectrode and seemed to be capable of evoking memories. So he could evoke supposedly very specific memories when he stimulated a particular region of the brain. And that gave rise to this sort of localist perspective that there are individual regions of the brain where specific memories for specific events or specific people are being neatly stored, and kind of like what he called an engram or an encoding of the memory. The other argument is that there's a much more distributed representation of memories, so they're not necessarily stored in one neuron or one local cluster, but they're really sort of dotted around. And in order to recall and to activate a memory, what's required is a sort of connectionist distributed pattern of activity. So for example, the localist view would argue that one neuron over here or cluster would need to fire for activation, whereas the distributed view would argue that it's not necessarily this one neuron firing over here, it's this neuron, this neuron, this neuron that fires would activate one specific representation, whereas if you want to activate another memory, this neuron, this neuron, this neuron would need to respond. And the evidence for this, principally in the early days, came from work by Carl Lashley. And he was someone who was really interested in trying to search for this engram or biological memory trace. And his technique for trying to identify this was teaching an animal a task, so typically some sort of motor skill, and then would cause a lesion in a region of the cortex, and then observe what are the effects of this lesion on the learned task performance, with the idea that slowly you're going to be able to pin down, if I cause a specific lesion to this region and the animal can't perform this skill that it's already learned, then that region must be responsible. Now the problem is with this is that after 30 years of research, he reported being entirely unsuccessful. So 30 years worth of slicing away and causing lesions in animals is not really that fruitful. So the lesions clearly disrupted performance, but there was nothing sort of specific to the location that he was making these lesions that indicated that that region was where the skill had necessarily been acquired here. So despite this, a lot of the early advances in understanding the neural basis of perception led support to this localist view of how neurons represented information. So if you remember back to the research by Torsten Hubel and Wiesel, so they did single cell recording within the visual cortex of cats and identified that you had individual cells that respond selectively to certain features. And as you progressively moved up through the visual cortex, you found cells that would respond to combinations of features. And this sort of discovery fed the idea that maybe there's other cognitive contents that might be similarly represented by localized clusters of neurons. And then there was a sort of rather facetious suggestion that by maybe there's like if you have an individual cell that responds to the concept of yellow, and you've got an individual cell that responds to the concept of a Volkswagen, then maybe there's a cell that responds selectively to the combination of these two. So it would only fire when you see a yellow Volkswagen. And there was also speculation about maybe there's a single cell that fires upon viewing your grandmother. And this became a sort of mythical search for the existence, and no one really took it that seriously, like there was going to be a single cell that responded to something as specific and as unique as your grandmother. Until more recently, there was some research by Rodrigo Quiroga and colleagues.
My research is in neuroscience. I'm very interested in how the brain works, and we study different aspects of brain functioning. Specifically, we are interested in perception, how do we see, and in memory, how we can form new memories and how we can recall experiences from the past. So the Jennifer Aniston neuron was a neuron I found in one patient some time ago that fired to many different pictures of Jennifer Aniston. So these are recordings that are done for clinical reasons, to try to cure patients from epilepsy. And this allows us the opportunity to record single cells in human subjects. So what I found is that in this patient, I show many different pictures of Jennifer Aniston and the neuron fired, and I show many other pictures of other people and the neuron did not. So basically what this means is that there are neurons in the human brain that represent concepts, as opposite to particular visual features of one picture or the other. So basically, building up from the finding of these Jennifer Aniston neurons, we realized they are neurons that represent concepts. And these neurons are actually in areas that we know that are very much involved in memory. For this, we did an experiment that was done by Matthias Sison, who is a lecturer here in the center and also at the engineering department. And what Matthias did, he was showing different people in different places. Like, for example, Jennifer Aniston by the Eiffel Tower and so on. So then we saw that the neuron that was originally firing to a person, say to Julia Roberts, the moment the patient remembered a new memory, start firing also to the associated place, like the White House. And this happened even after one trial. And that's critical because this shows for the very first time how neurons can encode memories even after one presentation, which is what happens in the human brain, because we only need to see something once to be able to remember it. The impact of these findings is to understand a very basic mechanism of memory formation. And I think this has a huge impact for basic neuroscience because the long-term possibility that might be helpful for pathologies like Alzheimer's disease. And this is because Alzheimer's involves exactly the area that we study, which is the hippocampus. So we want to understand Alzheimer's disease and potential treatments. You first have to understand how the normal brain works. And when we understand the mechanism of the normal brain, we can wonder what happens in the pathological cases so that leads to these devastating conditions. I think the brain is one of the most interesting things that is yet to be understood, and I consider myself quite privileged to be able to work on that.
So Quarega et al. Essentially inserted electrodes into the medial temporal lobes. This is regions of the hippocampus, the amygdala, the entorhinal cortex of epilepsy patients during surgery. So this is a kind of rare opportunity in humans to do single cell recording, and then they would record the responses, and something was considered a response if you get activity spikes less than 1 second, to a range of different visual stimuli. So they would present different objects, different people, animals, landmarks, and this kind of so-called grandmother cell, or grandmother neuron, was kind of revealed in this study, and he called it a Jennifer Aniston neuron, for the basis that they identified one neuron that would respond selectively to Jennifer Aniston, and it wasn't just to a single photo, it was to any different presentation of Jennifer Aniston, but wouldn't respond to anything else. Similarly, single cell recording from the hippocampus of another patient identified a cell that would fire selectively and exclusively and consistently for pictures of the actress Halle Berry. So any time that they showed an image of her, including a line drawing, and also even to the spelling of her name, they would always elicit consistent activity in this neuron. So again, you can see on here, we've got different images of Halle Berry, and then underneath it, you've got what's known as a kind of spike train, which is indicating the amount of responses, the amount of times the neuron would fire after presenting that image. So in the dashed lines that come down, that's indicating the start and the stop of the presentation of the stimuli or the image there. So you can see really consistent responding along that top row to the Halle Berry image, but in the bottom row for the other stimuli, there's not really much that's there. So how exactly are neurons related to concepts and ideas? And this is a question that is still up for substantial debate in neuroscience research. On the left-hand side, we have an illustration of what it would look like from the very strict grandmother cell perspective, so the idea that each individual neuron corresponds to a single concept or idea. And I think most researchers would agree wholeheartedly that this interpretation is very implausible. It's very unlikely. Alternatively, you could have a sparse representation where a individual neuron might respond to more than one concept or idea. Alternatively, you can have what's known as a fully distributed representation, and in this case, every single neuron could have some role to play in the representation of particular concepts, and it's the pattern of activation and deactivation of neurons that would then lead to you being able to represent or generate the concept that you're looking for. So in this case, the concept of Einstein might be activated by the firing of 3 of those neurons and the suppression of another 2 of them. So if we think that perhaps there is a grandmother neuron after all, some of the important limitations of this is the fact that despite them trying their best to make this as controlled a study as possible, it was done in a clinical context. There was limited time, as there was limited time to go through as many stimuli as they would have liked, and not presenting enough stimuli. There's probably several things that they would have liked to have controlled for that they weren't capable of controlling for. It's also the case that even in a distributed memory representation, you are going to get some neurons that respond consistently and invariantly to a range of different representations of the same stimuli or the same context, and it just seems kind of implausible that they could have hit upon the one cell out of billions that are going to be there that would be specific to Jennifer Aniston or Halle Berry. It's also important to note that a lot of this work is going on in the medial temporal lobe, and specifically in the hippocampus here, which is not where most memories are stored in long-term memory. So we know that long-term memory is transferred from the hippocampus to being stored in regions of the cortex. So sampling cells in the hippocampus might be more likely to tap in to cells that kind of serve a slightly different role. So they serve as a kind of indexing rather than a memory store. So they're known to have some sort of role in being able to identify or access where those memories are stored in long-term memory in the cortex, but they're not necessarily the location of where these memories are actually being stored themselves. It's almost like you find the index card that locates all of that information.